So it's a good question. How can Brazil benefit from a price on carbon? It's interesting that everyone's talking about the need to put a price on carbon at the moment, and of course more and more countries and regions are implementing a price on carbon. So we should also ask the question about what would be the disadvantages to Brazil of not implementing a price on carbon. I think there are a couple of reasons why a price on carbon is a good thing generally, and then let me talk about Brazil more specifically. It's for businesses, a price signal is the thing that they respond to best. So a very clear signal that something that they're doing is going to cost them more will encourage them to do it less. So putting a price on the pollution of carbon dioxide will encourage these companies to invest in energy efficiency, in switching fuels, and improving processes and products. So it's the signal that business loves the best. Having said that, it won't solve all problems. So there are some parts of the economy where you really need to use product performance standards. So you should be careful not to assume that carbon pricing is the silver bullet that solves everything. But it's a core policy tool to help drive emissions reductions. And given Brazil's very positive and bold commitments in its recently submitted INDC, I think there'll be an expectation from a lot of businesses and investors that that'll be followed up with a carbon pricing policy as one of the tools to ensure that INDC is implemented. Some things to look out for that investors and businesses really want from carbon pricing. It's not just a price signal, it's a long-term stability. So a sense that this is going to be around for a while, that the trajectory is known, whether it's through a predicted cap and trade regime where the cap comes down so that people know what the overall constraint on the economy will be, or whether it's a stepped tax, or whether it's a combination of the two, like in California where you have a cap and trade scheme but a carbon floor price which goes up by inflation plus 3% every year, which allows people to know what the investment case is. The other thing to think about is that Brazil's not in isolation. It's not just about what Brazil does, but about what other countries are doing. So as I say, growing numbers of countries are implementing carbon prices. Europe has had one for a while. More and more states in America, and California has one, and with the new Clean Power Plan, many more states will have one. Most of the provinces of Canada have one through cap and trade or tax. China is implementing one globally. India has a coal tax, and coal is the main source of power, so it's effectively a carbon tax. Chile's just announced one. So just in terms of Brazil's standing in the international community, there's also something about being part of the overall club of countries who are forward thinking and who are using the best tools to tackle climate change. And that brings me to one of the key issues around carbon pricing, that's competitiveness. And it works in several ways. So first thing to say is that we know that for example, in Canada, where British Columbia implemented the carbon tax some time ago, and in California, where that state has had carbon pricing when the rest of the states haven't, that we don't see any evidence of competitiveness disadvantage. So both the province of British Columbia and the state of California are more competitive than their fellow provinces and states. So there's some suggestion that well-designed price on carbon is a boost to overall competitiveness. But the key's in the phrase well-designed, because of course there are some businesses who, if they have too big a cost imposed on them through a carbon price, could end up losing competitiveness compared to a neighbouring country. Steel and cement are the big issues. But the policymakers have found very good ways of mitigating that so that there isn't so-called carbon leakage forcing those industries to go elsewhere, possibly where the emissions are higher. In fact, the World Bank's just issued some research which shows that there's no evidence whatsoever of any of that kind of leakage so far in the schemes that have been implemented. So I think that Brazil can take heart from that, design well, learn the lessons, and implement. The other thing to say is that there's also the negative possibility of competitiveness for countries who haven't got a price on carbon. There's already been some talk of border adjustment tariffs. California, for example, has talked about it. Larry Summers in the States talked about the possibility of a $25 a tonne border adjustment tariff for goods imported from countries that don't have effective carbon pricing. So that's also something to think about in terms of being part of this global club. I'd say overall what we see is that we need to get better at having this conversation about carbon pricing, because everyone's saying we need a price on carbon, but whether it's $1 a tonne or $100 a tonne, whether it affects all sectors the same or whether cement is dealt with differently than electricity generation is a huge issue. So that's why we've developed these this carbon pricing toolkit, which has a set of carbon pricing bands so that we can talk better about what prices work. So we define the introductory band, the level that most countries start at, and then the operational band where it really starts to drive transformation in the economy. And these 4 narratives of success or failure, because how we manage this collectively as businesses and governments around the world will determine the path that we take, whether we stay within 2 degrees by expertly managing the balance of national policies and international policies of trade and linking of carbon markets and carbon prices, and how countries balance the explicit carbon pricing of tax or cap and trade with the implicit pricing from regulating other sectors. We have one scenario of success where we show the world successfully navigating that complexity, and then 3 of failure. So I'd encourage anybody to read those and explore those, and explore what the real questions are for them in their country, in their industry, to help form a strong and well-informed opinion about why carbon pricing is good for their company, for their country, and so they can engage constructively with policymakers. Final thing I'd say is, of course, Brazil is uniquely well endowed in certain respects, which I think should make it a real champion of carbon pricing. Brazil has very high levels of carbon-free electricity already because it's hydro resources, and of course it has this amazing carbon sink that the INDC that Brazil's just submitted sees really tapping into of the forests, this huge forest country, and so a price on carbon and actually paying people to sequester carbon by looking after forests would be a huge positive for Brazilian economy and for Brazilian society, particularly those people living in forested areas. So lots of reasons why it's time for Brazil to put a price on carbon. Everyone says we need to put a price on carbon. I frequently hear all we need is a global price on carbon. And indeed, over 1,000 companies in 73 countries signed the World Bank statement to that effect last year. And this year, the work of CDP shows us that over 1,000 companies are either using an internal price on carbon, so that means they're expecting it to come from regulators, or they're planning to do so within the next 2 years. And we already have carbon pricing schemes, whether tax or cap and trade, in over 40 jurisdictions, and more all the time, and most importantly, in the near future, the Chinese cap and trade scheme becoming the world's biggest as it goes national. But we need global adoption of carbon prices. At the moment it's a patchwork, and if that patchwork becomes too different, we'll have all sorts of competitiveness and trade issues. We need high enough carbon prices to drive the technological transition that is necessary for us to stay within 2 degrees, the target that has been agreed by the international community to avoid the worst risks of the worst impacts of climate change. And we need over time to make sure that the mismatches between price levels are not so great that they cause trade imbalances. So we have a lot of agreement. It's very important. It's one of the key tools to manage the transition to a low carbon economy. But still the conversation often gets stuck at, we need to put a price on carbon. And there seems to me that there's a big gap in the conversation between agreeing we need to put a price on carbon and the detailed policy design, which can very quickly get very technocratic and lose the C-suite and the business or investment community. And so what we've done is we've come together with a group of experts over the last 6 months to produce a toolkit to try and help us have a better strategic conversation about carbon pricing. In particular, so that we can learn to ask better questions, because it's the right questions that will lead to the right answers. And this is crucial because this is not only one of the most important economic tools to manage this transition, but because if we don't deploy those tools right, we'll have the negative economic effects of a higher warming scenario with the negative social and political effects as well. So it's not just about making sure we choose the right path, it's also about being aware of the implications and some of the pitfalls of choosing the wrong path. So the Carbon Pricing Pathways Toolkit is a simple set of tools to help us explore this very complex space of policy decisions which of course will be different by sector and jurisdiction, depending on the politics and the economics and the industrial mix in each country. But we think this is a generic toolkit that can help anybody engage with this complex issue and come up with better questions which lead to better answers. So what's in the toolkit? Well, there's really two things. The first is there's what we call carbon pricing bands. It's a very simple idea. We've learned that people are very reluctant to name carbon price. If you ask a CEO, what do you think the right price on carbon is to drive the shift from coal to gas generated electricity in Europe? Often you'll get either silence or the market should decide. We don't think that's good enough. If investors have to make decisions about which companies are robust for a likely higher carbon price world, and policymakers have to set policies which will drive behaviour change, then we need to have a much better idea of what those price levels are. So the idea of carbon pricing bands is that we define some levels which are determined by the kind of behaviour they have. So negative carbon pricing, subsidies, bad, we need to get rid of it. There's some great progress in the last months. Countries like Indonesia removing carbon pricing, removing fuel subsidies, which, as I say, are effectively negative carbon prices. The second band, the first positive band, is what we call introductory carbon pricing. Between $0 and $20, actually that's where most schemes start. It's where the European scheme it seems to be stuck, but it's where relatively new schemes like in California or the new one announced in Chile all start. Relatively low level, but enough to send a signal to the economy that this pollutant, carbon dioxide, is going to have a price from now on, and to start to incentivize energy efficiency and to have companies thinking longer term about what kind of technology they invest in. Then the next band above that, $20 to $50 roughly, what we call the operational band, where fuel switching really starts to kick in. As I say, of particular importance in Europe at the moment is the need to switch from coal to gas. In the UK, which has an effective price of nearly $30, we're seeing that with the UK shutting coal-fired power stations. It looks like the last one will be shut by 2023. Different countries that may be different, but that band. And then higher than that, the transformation level, the level really needed to drive implementation of fossil fuel free electricity, particularly renewably generated electricity. So 50 to 80. Above that, it starts to get really hard to have a carbon price because of political reasons, because the economy won't support levels very high. There are exceptions, like in Sweden, where they have targeted price of over $130, but they've had like 20 years to get used to that, and it's only for certain parts of their economy. So just a way of talking about carbon pricing bands. So is the carbon price that you're considering or that you're experiencing in the introductory level or in the operational level? When will it get to the operational level? When will it get to the transformational level? We see quite a lot of companies in their internal carbon pricing assuming future carbon prices in that sort of $20 to $70 level. So assuming that it's going to get into the operational and the transformational level. Royal DSM just announced a couple of weeks ago in New York that they're using an internal price of €50, which is about $60, so into that transformational level. I'm here in Brazil where Vale are using a price of $50, for example. The second element of the toolkit is a way of looking at how the price of carbon might develop over the future, depending on the approach that we take for policy mix around the world. So we have 4 different trajectories of that future carbon price with a narrative, a story of the policy choices and the events which typified that. It's an exercise in future thinking, so it's not a prediction, but it's to illustrate the kind of dynamics that are at play and how they might play out. In the success scenario, sailing to the new world, we see the carbon price on average rising gradually and through the 2020s, peaking towards the end of the 2020s in the $70 range, and then actually starting to come down as technological innovation means that renewable electricity generation, for example, has gone beyond the point where it needs a carbon price to support it and is just taking off as a major part of the energy mix. We also have some narratives and trajectories where we get it wrong, and we think that's important to understand how some of these complex dilemmas might be mismanaged so that we end up failing to stay on a 2-degree track. Of course, there's the one where we basically do very little more than we're doing now, which is a kind of a 4-degree world, which has been well described by many, which is quite an ugly world of increasing economic impacts and increasing social impacts of the kind that will make the current refugee crisis affecting Europe pale into insignificance as we see more and more climate-driven refugees as agriculture fails around the world. So that's one that we all know we want to avoid. Perhaps more interesting is the scenarios in the middle where we make some progress on carbon pricing but either don't link up different schemes, so we have kind of chaotic price levels and trade issues, or where we have well-linked schemes but we only have a part of the world implementing prices. So one scenario we describe as sailing into the cliff, where despite having very good international mechanisms for linking trading schemes and taxes, only a minority of countries implement carbon pricing, which means that we don't make enough progress on reducing emissions in the medium term until a set of severe weather events all coming together and causing massive human and economic loss prompt the world's governments into crisis mode, and we leap to a very high level of carbon. In fact, that's not dissimilar to a scenario which the mining giant BHP Billiton have just published. They're looking at their scenarios of how to stay within 2 degrees. And in their scenarios, they said that the well-managed world would go to about $50, and in that kind of crisis response, it would go to 80. Actually, in our world, it would go much higher, well above 100. But the point there is that in that mismanaged world where there's a sudden correction, a sudden realization that we have to put a much higher price on carbon, we probably won't stay within 2 degrees because it's too slow a response, and the economic damage will be much greater. It won't just be the economic damage of the climate impacts, but a sudden economic correction like going from a low price of say $20 to 1 over 100 would lead to the sudden stranding of a lot of assets and a lot of wasted capital around the world. So the well-managed transition, what we call sailing into the new world, will manage a smooth deployment of carbon pricing around the world, ratcheting up the price so that it drives the right transformation to get the right environmental outcomes, and intelligently finding ways to link and converge schemes so we don't have these trade mismatches. If we don't get that, we could be sailing into the cliff or sailing into stormy waters, one of the other scenarios. So toolkit's available for everyone to use. It's an open source toolkit. We'd encourage you to read it in depth, to discuss it, to explore it. Let us know what questions it raises for you, what are the relevant questions for you, and provide us with feedback. As I say, we're planning to update the toolkit every year, and it'll be those who use it the most who help us to improve it that will work with us to write the carbon pricing pathways toolkit version 2.0, which we'll publish next year. So encourage you to use it. It's one of the most important policy tools that we need to implement together to make sure that our economy thrives in a world where warming is restricted to less than 2 degrees.